She slid into the empty stool next to me at the airport bar, smelling like rain and sheer, unfiltered panic. I was on my third black coffee, staring at the muted television screen above the rows of liquor bottles, trying to ignore the dull ache in my lower back. She did not order a drink. Instead, she gripped the edge of the polished mahogany counter until her knuckles turned the color of old bone. She leaned in close, her shoulder brushing against my heavy canvas jacket. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to cut through the low hum of the terminal. "Please, just for 10 minutes, tell him you are marrying me." I turned my head slowly, my fingers still wrapped around the warm porcelain of my coffee mug. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the reflection in the mirror behind the bar. I followed her gaze and saw him. He was a tall man wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my truck, walking with the kind of effortless entitlement that makes crowds part instinctively. He was scanning the concourse, his eyes cold and methodical. "Who is he?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "My nightmare," she replied, her breath catching in her throat. I did not know her name. I did not know her story. I only knew that the look in her eyes was the exact same look a trapped animal gets right before it stops fighting and just waits for the end. I missed my flight to Seattle because of her. I gave up my seat, my itinerary, and my quiet, predictable life. And that decision, made in the span of 3 erratic heartbeats, turned out to be the best mistake of my entire life. That is exactly how I met my wife. Let me back up. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am 34 years old, and I work as an industrial facilities superintendent in the city of Chicago. I am the guy they call when the massive, ancient boilers in the basements of century-old skyscrapers decide to stop working in the dead of winter. I am the guy who fixes the things that other people do not even want to look at. It is a quiet life, a dirty life, and for a very long time it was a completely empty life. Before that afternoon at the airport, I was switched off. I was a ghost haunting my own existence, moving from one mechanical failure to the next without ever really feeling the cold or the heat. I had convinced myself that I was the kind of man who simply did not get a family, who did not get a warm house filled with laughter. I believed I was meant to stay in the basement. That belief did not come out of nowhere. It was forged over 5 grueling years in sterile hospital rooms, watching the only family I had left slowly fade away. My father was a master carpenter, a man who built houses with his bare hands and believed that silence was just another kind of strength. When he got sick, the illness took his strength first, then his memory, and finally his dignity. I quit my job at a major engineering firm to take care of him full-time. I changed his clothes, I fed him his meals, and I sat by his bed listening to the rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of the oxygen concentrator. My fiancée at the time, a woman who loved the ambitious engineer but could not stand the exhausted caretaker, walked out on me during year 3. She told me I was stagnating. She told me she could not pause her life just because mine had come to a grinding halt. 6 months later, she married a man who worked in finance, a man who never had dirt under his fingernails. When my father finally passed away, I was left with a mountain of medical debt, an empty house, and a profound, hollow numbness that settled into my bones like winter frost. I stopped wanting anything. I stopped looking at people, stopped engaging in conversations that were not strictly about pipe gauges and electrical loads. I just worked, slept, and existed. But my father had left me with one piece of wisdom that I could never quite shake, a principle that rattled around in my empty head on the darkest nights. He used to say, "Arthur, you never measure a man by how he stands in the sunshine. You measure him by how he holds the umbrella for someone else in the pouring rain." He also taught me that you never force a stripped bolt. You work it gently, you earn its movement, and you never, ever leave a stranded driver in the dark. Those words were the only compass I had left. So, when the woman at the airport bar gripped the counter and begged me to be her shield, the ghost inside me stirred. I set my coffee mug down. "Put your hand on my knee," I told her, my voice perfectly level. She blinked, startled by the calm authority in my tone. "What?" she whispered. "If we are getting married, we are going to look like we actually like each other," I said, turning my body toward hers and sliding my arm across the back of her chair. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing a trembling hand on my denim-clad knee. Her fingers were freezing. I leaned in, bringing my face inches from hers, and let out a soft, relaxed laugh, as if she had just told me the funniest joke in the world. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man in the tailored suit stop dead in his tracks. He stared at us, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing into cold slits of calculation. He took a step toward the bar, but I shifted my posture just enough to block his direct line of sight to her face. I did not glare at him. I did not puff out my chest like a ridiculous barroom brawler. I just looked at him with the mild, polite confusion of a man wondering why a stranger was interrupting his private moment with his fiancée. The man in the suit paused, his confidence faltering against the sheer, impenetrable wall of my indifference. He checked his expensive watch, sneered in our general direction, and turned sharply on his heel, marching toward the first-class boarding lane. The woman beside me let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Her hand fell away from my knee, and she buried her face in her hands. "Thank you," she choked out, her shoulders shaking. "Thank you. You have no idea." "My name is Arthur," I said, sliding a napkin toward her. "Clara," she whispered, wiping her eyes. Before I could ask her why a man in a bespoke suit was hunting her through Terminal 3, the overhead speakers crackled to life. A tired-sounding gate agent announced that due to a massive, unprecedented winter storm system sweeping across the northern plains, all flights to Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver were officially grounded. The airport was shutting down. A collective groan echoed through the concourse, followed by the frantic shuffling of hundreds of stranded passengers rushing the customer service desks. Clara stared at the departure board, the color draining completely from her already pale face. "No," she breathed, standing up so fast her stool wobbled. "No, no, no. I have to be in Seattle by tomorrow night. I have to." "So does he, I assume?" I asked, nodding toward the gate where the man in the suit was now aggressively berating a helpless airline employee. Clara swallowed hard and nodded. "He is the best man," she said, her voice hollow. "And you?" I asked. "I am the maid of honor," she replied. I looked at the departure board, a sea of flashing red letters spelling out the word canceled over and over again. Then I looked at Clara. She looked so incredibly defeated, so small against the crushing weight of whatever burden she was carrying. I thought about going back to my empty apartment. I thought about the silence waiting for me there, the absolute, suffocating nothingness of my routine. Then I thought about my father and the umbrella in the rain. "I have 3 weeks of accrued vacation time," I said quietly. Clara turned to look at me, confusion knitting her brow. "I have a driver's license, and I know how to handle a vehicle in the snow," I continued, pulling my phone out of my pocket. "What are you saying, Arthur?" she asked, her voice tentative. "I am saying that if you need to be in Seattle by tomorrow night, we cannot wait for the airlines to figure this out." "We?" she repeated, the word hanging in the air between us. "I missed my flight to a trade convention I did not even want to attend," I said smoothly, lying through my teeth to make her feel less like a burden. "I am renting a 4x4 truck. I am driving west. If you want a ride, you can have the passenger seat." She stared at me for a long time, searching my face for any sign of deception, any hidden motive. She found none because there were none. I was just a guy who fixed things, and she looked like she needed a mechanic for her life. "Why would you do this for a complete stranger?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Because," I said, picking up my duffel bag, "you do not force a stripped bolt, and you do not leave a stranded driver in the dark. Let us go." We managed to secure the very last heavy-duty rental truck at O'Hare, a massive black machine with 4-wheel drive and tires thick enough to chew through a glacier. The storm was already starting to dump heavy, Wet snow onto the highways as we merged onto Interstate 90, heading west into the gathering dark. The first few hours were filled with the tense, fragile silence of two strangers who had just made a ridiculously impulsive decision. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the leather steering wheel, letting the heater blast warm air into the cab. Clara sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the endless stream of red taillights blurring in the snow. Somewhere around the Wisconsin border, the tension finally snapped. "His name is Julian," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. I did not look away from the road. "The man in the suit." "Yes," she said, pulling her knees up to her chest. "He is my ex-boyfriend, and he is the brother of the groom." "That makes for a complicated wedding," I observed mildly. Clara let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "You have no idea, Arthur. It is not just complicated. It is a trap." Over the next 300 miles, as we pushed through the blinding snow of Wisconsin and into the frozen plains of Minnesota, Clara told me the truth. She laid out the entire ugly reality of her predicament, and as she spoke, the picture of the resilient, misunderstood woman beside me came into sharp focus. Her younger sister, Elise, was marrying Julian's brother. Elise was sweet, gentle, and suffered from a severe neurological condition that required constant, incredibly expensive medical care. Julian's family was wealthy, old untouchable money. When Elise and his brother fell in love, Julian's family graciously offered to cover all of Elise's medical expenses, moving her into a state-of-the-art facility near their estate in Seattle. It was a miracle for Clara's family, a lifeline they desperately needed. But Julian was not a miracle. Julian was a predator who hid behind a charming smile and a platinum credit card. He had pursued Clara relentlessly, wearing her down with grand gestures until she finally agreed to date him. Behind closed doors, he was controlling, manipulative, and cruel. He isolated her, belittled her, and eventually, he cheated on her with one of her own co-workers. When Clara found out and tried to leave him, Julian did not apologize. He threatened her. He told her that if she made a scene, if she ruined his reputation or caused drama before his brother's wedding, he would ensure his family pulled every dime of funding from Elise's medical care. He told her he would ruin her sister's life just to teach Clara a lesson in loyalty. So, Clara did the only thing she could do to protect her vulnerable sister. She took the blame. She allowed Julian to spin a narrative to their families and friends that she was the unstable one, the difficult one, the woman who had suffered a hysterical breakdown and ruined the relationship out of irrational jealousy. Her own parents, terrified of losing the financial support for Elise, chose to believe Julian's polished lies over Clara's desperate truths. The world looked at Clara and saw a villain, a chaotic mess of a woman trying to ruin her sister's fairy tale wedding. She was a pariah, completely isolated, carrying a heavy, self-sacrificing burden so her sister could live in peace. "He cornered me at the airport," Clara whispered, her breath fogging the passenger window. "He told me that if I did not play the part of the apologetic, crazy ex at the wedding, he would make sure Elise suffered. He wanted me to grovel. He wanted to break me." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling a slow, cold anger building in my chest. I knew what it was like to be broken by circumstances outside your control. I knew what it was like to sacrifice everything for someone you loved, only to have the world treat you like you were invisible. "So why the fake fiancé routine?" I asked softly. Clara looked down at her hands. "Because Julian is obsessed with winning. If he thinks I am broken and alone, he will keep torturing me. But if he thinks I have moved on, if he thinks I found someone else and I am happy, it neutralizes him. He loses his leverage over my emotions. He cannot stand to see you standing in the sunshine," I murmured, echoing my father's words. Clara nodded slowly. "Exactly. Then we need a better story," I said, glancing at her. "What do you mean?" "If I am going to be the man who pulled you out of Julian's shadow, we need to know each other. We need an invention." That was how the agreement was struck. As we drove through the endless, dark stretch of Interstate 90, we built a fortress of fiction around us. We decided we met at a coffee shop in Chicago. We decided I spilled my drink on her laptop bag, and I insisted on paying for the dry cleaning. We decided our first date was at a terrible Italian restaurant where the pasta was cold but the conversation was electric. But somewhere in the middle of inventing this fake relationship, the strangest thing happened. We stopped inventing and started actually talking. I told her about my father, about the smell of sawdust in his garage, and the sound of his breathing machine. I told her about the fiancé who left me, and the deep, abiding fear I had that I was fundamentally unlovable. I confessed things to this stranger in the dark cab of a truck that I had never said out loud to anyone. And Clara listened. She did not offer empty platitudes or pitying looks. She just listened with an intense, quiet empathy that made me feel like I was finally being seen after years of invisibility. By the time the sun began to rise over the frosted fields of South Dakota, the ghost inside me was fully awake. I was feeling again. I was feeling the warmth of the heater, the vibration of the road, and a strange, terrifying pull toward the woman sleeping softly in the passenger seat. The defining moment, the moment of absolute seeing, happened at a rundown diner just outside of Rapid City. We had stopped for breakfast, exhausted and running on fumes. The diner was packed with stranded truckers and weary travelers. Our waitress was a young girl, maybe 19, who looked like she was on the verge of tears as she rushed between tables. A large, red-faced man in a trucker hat at the booth next to ours was relentlessly berating the girl because his eggs were cold. He was loud, obnoxious, and utterly cruel, enjoying the power he had over someone who could not fight back. I was about to stand up, my muscles tensing for a confrontation, when Clara moved first. She did not yell. She did not make a scene. She simply picked up the fresh, steaming pot of coffee from our table, walked over to the man's booth, and began pouring him a cup. "You know," Clara said, her voice dripping with a calm, freezing authority that demanded absolute silence. "My fiancé is an industrial electrician. He works with high voltage all day, and he is very, very tired." The red-faced man stopped yelling and looked up at her, startled. "He has not slept in 2 days," Clara continued, smiling a perfectly terrifying smile. "And if you say one more disrespectful word to this hard-working girl, I am going to let him explain the concept of alternating current to you in the parking lot. Do we understand each other?" The man swallowed hard, looked at my sheer size sitting quietly in the booth, and nodded mutely. Clara turned to the waitress, handed her a $20 bill from her own pocket, and said, "Keep the change, honey. You are doing great." She walked back to our booth, sat down, and calmly took a bite of her toast. I stared at her, completely awestruck. That was the moment. That was the exact second I knew I was entirely, hopelessly in love with her. She was not a victim. She was a warrior who had simply been forced to fight in the dark for too long. If you believe in love that shows up when all the lights go out, you understand why I am telling you this story. You understand why you should listen to stories like this, why you might even want to subscribe to the idea that good things still happen in a broken world. We pushed through the mountains of Montana and Idaho, racing against the clock. The weather cleared as we crossed the Cascade Range, and by the time we pulled into the gravel driveway of the sprawling Seattle estate, it was late afternoon. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for that evening. Clara was terrified, her hands shaking as she pulled her dress from her suitcase in the parking lot of the hotel where we had booked a single room to keep up appearances. "I cannot do this," she whispered, leaning against the side of the muddy truck. "Julian is going to tear me apart in front of everyone." I stepped close to her, placing my large, calloused hands on her shoulders. "Look at me, Clara," I said softly. She lifted her tear-filled eyes to mine. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," I told her, meaning every single syllable. "You protected your sister when no one else would. You took the hits. Tonight, you do not take any hits. Tonight, I am your shield." I offered her my arm. Let us go to a party. The rehearsal dinner was held in a massive, opulent tent on the lawn of the estate, glowing with fairy lights and dripping with expensive floral arrangements. The moment we walked in, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Whispers erupted from the tables. Clara's parents looked at her with a mixture of embarrassment and panic. Elise, sitting in her specialized wheelchair near the head table, beamed with pure joy at the sight of her sister. And then there was Julian. He detached himself from a group of wealthy socialites and sauntered toward us, a smug, predatory smile plastered on his handsome face. "Clara," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I am so surprised you made it. I heard the flights were canceled. I assumed you would just give up and stay home, as usual." He turned his mocking gaze to me, looking me up and down, taking in my simple dark suit and rough hands. "And who is this? Your Uber driver?" Clara opened her mouth, her voice catching in her throat. I did not let her speak. I stepped forward, inserting my broad frame smoothly between Clara and Julian. "I am Arthur," I said, extending a hand. "Clara's fiancé." Julian looked at my hand and laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Fiancé? Right. Sure you are. Clara, really, this is pathetic even for you. Hiring a bodyguard to play pretend because you cannot handle the fact that I moved on?" The music in the tent had stopped. Everyone was watching us. Clara's father stood up, his face pale. "Julian, please, let us not cause a scene." "I am not causing a scene, Richard," Julian said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I am just calling out a desperate lie. Clara is unstable. We all know it. She nearly ruined my life with her jealousy. And now she brings a prop to my brother's wedding to try and steal the spotlight." Julian sneered at me. "How much did she pay you, pal? Because whatever it is, I will double it if you walk out that door right now." The silence in the tent was absolute, heavy and suffocating. I looked at Julian, seeing right through his expensive suit and his inherited arrogance, down to the pathetic small man beneath. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I tapped into that quiet, unshakable competence that I used to diagnose a failing boiler or a shattered circuit. "You know, Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "I work as an industrial electrician. My job is to find the hidden faults in massive, complex systems. I look for the rot behind the walls." Julian frowned, confused by the pivot. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I am talking about the fact that you are a very poor liar," I continued smoothly, taking a step closer to him, forcing him to crane his neck slightly to look me in the eye. "You see, on the drive here, Clara's phone kept ringing. It was a restricted number. I pulled my phone from my pocket. But I am a guy who fixes things. I ran a simple trace on the carrier logs. The calls were coming from your private office line in Seattle." Julian's face twitched. "I also took the liberty of looking up the public records of the apartment you rent downtown." I lied effortlessly, my voice steady as stone. "The one you kept under a corporate LLC. The one you used to cheat on Clara with her coworker, Jessica. The one you are currently using to cheat on your new girlfriend." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Julian's new girlfriend, standing a few feet away, dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the floor. "You are insane," Julian hissed, his charm completely evaporating, replaced by raw panic. "You have no proof of any of that." "I do not need proof," I said quietly, leaning in so only he could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "Look around you, Julian." The narrative just cracked. I turned my back on him, completely dismissing his existence, and offered my hand to Clara. She took it, her fingers warm and steady in mine. "Shall we go say hello to your sister?" I asked her. She smiled, a radiant, genuine smile that lit up the entire room, and nodded. "I would love that, Arthur." We walked past Julian, who was suddenly surrounded by an angry girlfriend, a furious brother, and a crowd of whispering guests. His carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing in real time, and he was powerless to stop it. The wedding the next day was beautiful. Julian was noticeably absent, having been quietly asked to leave by his own family after the groom demanded the truth and Julian's lies unraveled under the pressure. Clara's parents, finally seeing the reality of what their daughter had sacrificed, approached her with tearful apologies. Clara forgave them because that is who she was. She was the umbrella in the rain. When the reception ended, Clara and I walked out to the muddy black truck under a canopy of stars. The pretense was over. The job was done. I unlocked the doors, but Clara did not get in. She stood by the passenger side, shivering slightly in the cool night air, looking across the roof of the truck at me. "So," she said quietly, "you saved me." I shook my head, gripping the door handle. "No, Clara. I just held the light so everyone else could see who you really were." She walked slowly around the front of the truck, closing the distance between us until she was standing right in front of me. "The agreement is over," she whispered, looking up into my eyes. "The invention is finished." "I know," I said, my chest tightening with the sudden, terrifying realization that she was about to walk away and leave me to my empty life. "I do not want to go back to the basement, Arthur," she said, reaching up to rest her hand against my chest, right over my hammering heart. "This isn't pretend for me anymore." I looked down at her, at the woman who had dragged me back into the land of the living. "It was never pretend for me, Clara," I answered, wrapping my arms around her and pulling her close. "Not for a single second." We drove back to Chicago together, taking our time, stopping at every roadside attraction and greasy diner we could find. At 1 month, she helped me paint the walls of my dreary apartment a bright, warm yellow. At 6 months, we moved into a small house in the suburbs, a house with a garage where I could set up my father's old carpentry tools. At 1 year, we stood in the kitchen of that house, flour on our hands from baking bread, and I pulled my father's heavy gold wedding band out of my pocket. I did not get down on one knee. I just handed it to her, my hands shaking, and asked her if she wanted to keep driving with me for the rest of our lives. She said yes, crying so hard she ruined the dough. It has been 4 years since that frantic afternoon at the airport bar. Julian is a distant memory, a fading ghost of a man who lost his family's respect and his own dignity. Elise is thriving, living with us now, filling our home with laughter and the sound of her favorite television shows. And me, I am not a ghost anymore. I am a husband, a brother-in-law, and a man who finally understands the true meaning of my father's words. For a long time, I thought I was the hero of this story. I thought I was the brave mechanic who swooped in, rented a truck, and saved the damsel in distress from a terrible fate. But that is the arrogance of a man who has been alone too long. The truth, the absolute, undeniable truth, is that Clara saved me. She saw a man who had walled himself off from the world, a man who believed he was destined to be collateral damage in everyone else's story. She forced me to engage. She forced me to care, to protect, to fight, and ultimately to love. She rescued me from the deafening silence of my own isolation. If you have ever felt like a ghost in your own life, I want you to remember this. I want you to share that memory, to leave a thought below this moment, to tell me where in the world you are watching from. Because you never know when someone is going to slide onto the empty stool next to you and ask for a favor that will alter the trajectory of your entire existence. Would you have missed that flight? Would you have handed over the keys to your life to a stranger who smelled like rain and panic? I did. And it was the best mistake I ever made. You do not measure a person by how they stand in the sunshine. You measure them by how they hold the umbrella for someone else in the pouring rain. Ride safe.